Hi everyone, welcome to your first flipped video for this year in AP Human Geography. We're going to spend some time in this first video discussing the organization of your notes in your spiral notebook, which will be the same spiral notebook you use for the entirety of the year. So let's go ahead and get started just talking about some simple structural things. When you open up that spiral notebook, I'd like you to title your notes exactly as you would find the essential question for the video. So we'll start off with flipped video 1.1. and the title, How Has Geography Evolved as a Field of Inquiry? Because it's important that we understand how it is geography has developed historically so that we better understand the modern geographic tools and the geographic perspective. Please put your name and your period in the top right-hand corner as well as today's dates so that your notes will not only be organized by the flipped video but also by date, which will be helpful for you when you go back to review these notes come May, let's say the early May, when you're reviewing for the AP exam. So please go ahead and get started when you're ready. Please advance with us. Just a quick review again of what the Cornell Notes actually are and what this system is. You're going to be putting your key terms and your main ideas and your key topics on the left-hand side of your notes. Should you choose to phrase those as questions, as many people have been taught to do so, that's not a problem at all, whatever works best for you. On the right-hand side of your notes will be the majority of the paper. You're going to be writing down the definitions for terms, key ideas, and examples. So let me just show you a sample that I pulled from offline, just simply to show you why it is that we focus on this note structure. Not only is it best for summarizing your notes, but you'll notice on the left-hand side that if we eliminated those purple lines, your notes would still be perfectly chunked, so that if you were to flip back in these notes, you'd be able to easily, quickly identify key terms and vocabulary. So let's go ahead and get started. If we're talking about geography, we're going to start with some very basics and understanding what geography means and how it has evolved as a field of inquiry or a field of study. Let's begin first with the term geography. The word itself means earth, geo, writing, graphy. And that term is somewhat limited and a bit misleading in the idea that that would lead one to believe that geography is simply about depicting the earth or creating maps about the earth. But that's just a simple component, and the term geography reflects the pursuit of understanding the world around us and the processes and recording that information on maps. Speaking of maps, we'll speak about the word cartography. A significant portion of our time is going to be spent both creating maps and analyzing maps. And cartography is a term that references the practice or the science of creating maps. We're going to be spending some time discussing the limitations of this field, but the bottom line is that the map is the primary tool of the geographer, and that's going to be our primary tool as human geography students. Pausing for a minute just for some structural notes. I just want to take a look. If we were to follow the Cornell note-taking system, then your paper should look something like this. I myself use the pink line on the loose leaf paper as my left-hand side, perhaps you would like a little bit more space. But bottom line, we've got the terms on the left and the definitions on the right. Let's proceed now to speak about some of the earliest geographers, and there are many. I'm just simply going to highlight a few that the AP exam focuses upon. We'll start first in ancient Greece. A name, Aristotle, one you may know from your studies of ancient Greece or perhaps studies of philosophy. From 384 to 322 BCE, Aristotle, among many other things, studied the earth itself. And despite the very common myth that Christopher Columbus somehow was the first person to propose that the earth was round, that is simply inaccurate. We're talking hundreds, if not thousands of years beforehand, we've got people who are postulating the same ideas. And Aristotle was one of the first people to postulate. That word postulate means to propose. So if you didn't know what the word postulate, it means, please put that on the left-hand side with to propose on the right-hand side. First person to postulate that the earth was spherical, and he actually proposed some pretty simple explanations for why this is the case, but one of which is highlighted in that picture on the top right there. And he proposed that when the sun is behind the earth, so when we're talking about solstices, then when the sunlight is hitting the earth, and I'm going to use my arrow key for just a minute here, then when the earth's shadow as it is cast on the moon was in a curved nature, was a curved shape. So, and only a spherical body could create that circular shadow on the moon. So that's one of the earliest justifications for why it is that the Earth is in fact a sphere, coming from Aristotle in ancient Greece. Another Greek scholar named Eratosthenes, in 240 BCE, he actually was able to calculate the circumference of the Earth. If circumference is new to us, circumference, of course, being the distance around, the circumference of the Earth to a degree of extraordinary accuracy, considering that we're speaking about a time period thousands of years ago. And what his justification was relatively simple, and he used some very basic geographic concepts that you're going to study when you're in geometric concepts that you'll study when you're in geometry, where he was calculating the angle at which the sun was hitting the Earth, and knowing a known distance between those 2 points, he was able to actually then just use math to calculate with extraordinary accuracy the circumference of the Earth. Here's also nothing to copy down here on this slide, just wanted to show you some of the early efforts at cartography. If this map is a bit confusing to look at, that's quite understandable given that there are only 2 seas depicted on this map. We have the Northern Ocean is what Eratosthenes has described this, and the Atlantic Ocean below. So you'll notice we see some early attempts at understanding the Earth's surface coming out of ancient Greece. We'll continue thus discussing Claudius Ptolemy, though I just pronounced his name as if the P was silent, so Claudius Ptolemy, a very famous geographer and cartographer who created a map that was used for 1,000 years as the global standard for mapping. And it was from Ptolemy that we had the concepts of longitude and latitude, something we'll discuss at much greater length in the coming days. But longitude being lines that run north to south on Earth, and latitude being lines that run east to west. And those lines, these early indications of measurement, were pivotal for early travelers and early trade to help understand navigation tactics. But if you take a look at that early map there, you can see just how limited some of these early cartographic efforts were. You can see that the map was then expanded upon here for Ptolemy's view of the world, but just some early evolutions of the map. You do notice that the European continent, particularly Spain, and you can see the Mediterranean, is particularly well understood as trade increased across the world, particularly in the Indian Ocean, which should be down here. We see the better understanding of the map there itself. Continuing on, if we just another view of Ptolemy's world. Another very, very important scholar that we'll study both here in AP Human Geography, and if you have not yet taken World History 1, we'll do so there as well, is a man named Ibn Battuta, who was a Muslim scholar and a traveler, and whose maps were focused upon tracing the spread of the Islamic world, or the extent of the Islamic world. And his maps and his travel records were absolutely critical for the evolution of cartography and geography, because you can see from this really neat map, in fact, if you're interested, you can go on National Geographic and see a more interactive version of this map you see here. His travels were simply incredible. He traveled basically all the way from Western Africa all the way to China, and those maps really helped hone the world's understanding of this region of the world. So we see a greater evolution. We're going to make a relatively big jump here now, because I want to jump back to some of the early cartography. And once we've got the age of exploration, we have significant improvements. We have the evolution of the compass out of China. So there's significant maritime or sea trade that helped improve our understandings of the world and improve our maps. And I'm going to jump ahead a bit here because I want to talk about how geography now started to take on different characteristics of studying people and place, as opposed to simply focusing upon map making and cartography. And one of the people who helped make that shift was a man named George Perkins Marsh. Again, we got his name on the left-hand side. He was one of the first people to focus and to describe how Earth's natural systems are impacted by human actions. In other words, how the natural physical character of Earth is impacted by what it is that humans do. Now, it seems a little bit mundane or a little bit basic for you and I, because that's something that we hear and talk about often. But this was a shift in our thinking to start to consider how is it that we as humans are impacting the physical world around us, and how we need to study those changes over time. So that's really qualified as an entire field of geography called human environment interactions, which is going to play an enormous role in our perspective as geographers. How do humans impact the Earth, and how does the Earth impact human life? Now, in 1964, there was an effort done by a man named W.D. Patterson to really to then expand upon not just cartography, not just human-environment interactions, but actually quantifying or describing 4 distinct traditions or 4 distinct areas of geographic study. And these have evolved from, obviously, 1964, it's been some time, but these still stand at much of this still stands at the heart of what it means to be a geographer in modern times. A little bit of a sidebar here. Let's talk about how you need to be structuring your notes. Here's how I would do this. I would put Patterson's traditions on the left-hand side, and I would describe that on the right as just domains of geography or areas of geography established in 1964. And then I would treat each one of these different traditions shown here in green as a separate term. So let's see how this plays out. And just to show you again, here's Earth Science Tradition. I abbreviated this to say it's focus, and then 2 examples. The term EG is actually an abbreviation for the Latin term for 4 examples. So you'll see that often in people's writings and note-taking. E.G stands for example. You're welcome to use that in your own notes. So the Earth Science Tradition, that's essentially the sphere of geography. If geography was a pie, let's divide it into four quadrants, and one of those quadrants would be considered, according to Patterson, as the Earth Science Tradition, which is where we'd study the physical geography of the Earth, Earth's environmental systems, so things like geology, hydrology, where water is and changing water systems, paleontology, glaciology, looking at glaciers, global warming. So this is a little bit more on the physical science side. This is a critical component of geography. That isn't necessarily going to be the heart of our focus in this course, but it will certainly touch on and relate to all the human patterns and processes that we're going to study. The human environment tradition, the one we already just noticed, the one we just addressed, was the impact of nature upon humans and humans upon nature. You'll notice I put 3 stars next to this, which is representative of the fact that the human environment tradition, regional tradition, and spatial tradition are all larger components of AP Human Geography. In the human environment tradition, we're looking at natural hazards and disasters, how human actions cause them, how is human life affected by them. Environmentalism and possibilism, in other words, to what extent does human life affect the world? To what extent is the human world affected by the natural world? How does the population growth over time affect the world? How does the world affect population growth? So on and so forth. So that sort of reciprocal relationship. This is also called the man-land tradition or the human-land tradition. We got regional tradition as the third quadrant of our study here, also known as area studies. As geographers, we're consistently trying to look at the world, look at places, look at spaces, and say, what differentiates this place on Earth from another? What makes this place a region in a way that that place is not? So here's where we're looking at things like international trends. What makes this place different than that particular place? How has this place changed over time? What makes a specific place is known as regional studies. And lastly, this is the one that's going to be most important because this is the heart of AP Human Geography, is the spatial tradition. And here we're looking at where human and physical activity, meaning the natural world, occurs over space. When I say space in this course, I'm not referring to outer space. I'm referring to a place on Earth. So I want you to take a minute, close your eyes for a minute, and I want you to think of the globe. As a human geographer, you're going to be looking at what activities, what human processes, what life, what anything occurs where, why it occurs in that particular place, and why we should care. So for example, we're going to be looking at how does population change over space. Let's use that terminology I wrote here. What is where? Where are people? Why are people there? And why should we care if people are in that place versus that place? Let's sub in a different unit. What religion is practiced here? Why here? And why do we care? What languages are spoken in this place versus that place, and why does it matter? So when we're looking at things spatially, we're looking at how a particular process or phenomenon or trend is occurring in one place versus another, and we're trying to explain why. And a very simplistic way simplified way of saying that is we are studying the why of where. Why are apartments located in this area as opposed to this one? So it's a very broad analysis, and we're going to work with that, breaking down that definition further in the coming days. Looping us back now, because we just spent some time talking about W.D. Pattison and his 4 traditions of geography. As human geographers, it's also important that we know the work of Carl Sayer, who was one of the early, what he is most known for is this idea of a cultural landscape and how that landscape can actually be used to study a group of people. Let's back up for a minute. I'm going to give you a definition of a cultural landscape, and then I'm coming right back to that slide. So right now we should have Carl Sayer on the left in his definition, and now we got the word cultural landscapes on the left. Cultural landscapes are the physical evidence of human impact upon an environment. Back it up. Physical evidence of human impact. What can we physically see that humans have done to an environment? Another way of thinking of that is to say how humans imprint themselves upon the environment. If you take your fist and your thumb, I want you to imagine your thumb is human life. If you're pressing that to the table, if you removed your finger, then you'd say that you've made an imprint upon that place. What have humans built? What have they changed? What physical things can we see that have created a new life? So if you look at this picture, a new perspective of an area. So look at these 2 pictures here. The cultural landscape we're looking at the bottom right. This is, you may yourself be familiar with it. If not, you will be by the end of the year. This is Mecca, which is a city in Saudi Arabia. And this is during a very important religious pilgrimage called the Hajj that happens once a year. You can see the physical imprint of human life in this cultural landscape. You can see that that the types of buildings that have been built have religious significance, and the architecture is reflective of that religion. You can see here that the type of attire, the different systems, the city behind it. We can learn so much about people by looking at their cultural landscape and the way in which humans have altered the physical world around them. Let's go back for a minute to this other one. We can see when we look at this cultural landscape, the types of buildings that are being built, the resources that are being used to construct those houses, the fact that these houses are located on a river. We see we could also see, if you look closely, there's some cars in the background. So you got all kinds of evidence of human life and human existence. And Carl Sayer says that this cultural landscape is a real basis for studying different groups of people, of how we have physically created and impacted the environment around us. A couple more terms and we'll be wrapping up here shortly. Another term I want you to know, which is relevant to this idea of a cultural landscape. When we're studying cultural landscapes, sometimes what human geographers study is called sequent occupants. In other words, human geographers look at how different societies over time have continued to imprint themselves on a particular landscape. Here's what I mean. If we as human geographers have evolved in our studies so that we're not just simply making maps, we're looking at how a particular place has taken on the characteristics of different groups of people over time. On the top right, I found a picture of McKinley Tech in what I believe to be his approximately 1979. I can't confirm that, but I think that's approximately when this picture was taken. If we're looking at this picture of McKinley Tech, then we see, take a look at the background here in the streets and the extent to which here we see that the school's been built, we see the housing, we see obviously the groups of people, the parking lot. SequentOccupants has us looking at how different groups have come in and changed that landscape over time. Perhaps you know this, perhaps you don't. One of the initiatives under a former mayor, one of the immediate changes that was made to all of the schools was the creation of this turf field. We see that things have changed in terms of the housing. We see lots of new construction being built here on First and T and these different areas here. So different cultures come in and the same place can now be changed in many ways over time. So the actual definition concept with which states that successive societies leave their cultural imprint on a place. So this place right now in approximately 2012, that's a place, this McKinley Tech is representative not just of the people who were here in 2012, but as well as the impact that the people in 1979 made of this place. Here's a different way of describing sequent occupants. If you're looking at this landscape here, there's nothing on it. There's no cultural imprint. There's no evidence of human existence here. Now we see the presence of a railroad, right? So now humans have imprinted themselves on this landscape. As that evolved, we now have settlement. We have physical buildings. We have roads. We've got the people are now imprinting. We have the evidence of electricity being brought in with those power lines. We're further imprinting ourselves, more development, greater electricity, another house. We now have even more power, more development, more of a cultural imprint upon this place. Right? That original rail line still existed, but we're still imprinting with further societies. We see different types of buildings emerging with different infrastructure, greater cultural imprint. We still have that rail line, but now we have a tram coming in that's going to be used. The roads are now paved. So this is the same place, we'll just watch it evolve over time, that humans are successively imprinting themselves on a place. This is our cultural landscape. This is our human imprint. This is the same place that we began with. But as human geographers, we're looking about the why of where of this place and how human life is impacting the environment and vice versa. Okay, that's it for our first flipped video. What I'd like you to do now, you've been working in your spiral notebook. That spiral notebook is sacred. You go ahead and close that, and you're going to be bringing that with you to class to get credit for your Cornell Notes. What you're now going to do is take out a sheet of paper. This is going to be turned in to me. It's going to have the exact same title that you put on your notes. It's going to have Flipped Video 1.1 with the same heading, How has Geography Evolved as a Field of Inquiry? And you now have 5 analysis questions to answer. You never need to actually write down the question itself. You need to simply answer these questions here. You'll answer them in full and complete sentences. You'll notice that questions 3, 4, and 5 are referencing the next slide. Here is that next slide. Here's an example of how your analysis questions would be set up. Here is that next slide. So when you're doing this, since this is a video, this is a fast forward and rewind situation. I would like you to be analyzing this cultural landscape from the human environment tradition, regional tradition, and spatial tradition. You're going to be looking at what kinds of questions you would ask about a cultural landscape pictured there. I want you to come up with 2 questions if you were a human environment tradition geographer. Same thing for regional tradition and same thing for spatial tradition. These 5 questions are the other 50% of your homework assignment. First 50% are the Cornell Notes. Second 50% are these analysis questions. Please have this ready for the second day, but right when the bell rings, as this is going to be due at the beginning of class. See you in class.